The rain had been falling since dawn, drumming steadily against the tin roof of the old livestock auction house. Puddles gathered in the dirt pathways between pens, and the air smelled of damp hay, mud, and anxious horses. Men in worn coats stood with arms folded, their boots caked with grime, eyes scanning each animal with quick, calculating glances. Every creature was assessed by weight, build, and potential profit. To most of them, it was just another Saturday, another chance to trade muscle and speed for money. Yet in one corner, tied to a splintering rail, stood a horse that drew not the usual scrutiny, but a strange, uneasy silence. The animal's coat was once a glossy chestnut, but now dulled to a muddy brown, patchy where scars crossed his flanks. His ribs pressed sharply against thin skin, and one hind leg trembled beneath him as though carrying weight had become a burden too heavy to bear. His mane hung unkempt, tangled with straw. The horse's eyes, however, spoke more loudly than his broken body. They were hollow, void of the spark that marks the proud spirit of his kind. When the auctioneer's assistants tried to lead him closer to the block, he resisted with a quiet desperation, lowering his head, as though ashamed of being seen. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a quick gavel, tried to spin optimism from despair. "Here's a fine gelding," he barked, slapping his clipboard. "Strong bones. Just needs a little work. Who'll start me off at 1,000? His call met only with silence. The crowd shifted, some smirking, others shaking their heads. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer's voice dropped. 500, 200, 50. Still nothing. The horse flicked his ears, catching the disdain in every muttered comment. "Won't last the winter. Not worth the feed. Should have been put down." Finally the auctioneer sighed, irritation creeping into his tone. "All right, $1. Who'll give me $1 just to take him off our hands?" A few men laughed. The horse shuddered, a faint tremor rolling through his frame, as if the words themselves carried weight. From the back of the barn, a man stepped forward. He was not one of the wealthy breeders or sharp-eyed traders, but a rancher of modest means. His coat was worn at the edges, his hat pulled low to keep the rain from his face. His name was Ethan. For years, people had known him as a man who worked hard and spoke little, a man whose life had carried its share of quiet grief. His wife had passed 2 winters ago, leaving the ranch quieter than it had ever been. Since then, Ethan carried himself with the steady patience of someone who understood loss, but kept moving anyway. He studied the horse not with the sharp eyes of profit, but with something gentler, though no less piercing. He saw the scars, the weakness in the leg, the way the animal shrank from touch. But he also saw a flicker, something buried deep in those hollow eyes, fragile but not gone. Without thinking too long, Ethan raised his hand. "I'll take him." The gavel came down with a hollow crack. "Sold for $1." The announcement drew laughter from a crowd, a ripple of disbelief. One man muttered, "Fool's wasting his money." Another snorted, "That horse won't last the week." Ethan ignored them. He walked to the rail, taking the rope gently in his hands. The horse stiffened but did not pull away. The rain had slowed, though droplets still slid down from the edges of the roof, pattering on the dirt. Ethan leaned close, his voice low and steady. "You're coming with me now. No one's going to hurt you again." He tugged lightly, and after a hesitant pause, the horse followed. The walk back to the ranch was long. The road was slick with mud, the hills fading into mist. Ethan's truck rumbled ahead while he led the horse slowly on foot, unwilling to force a pace the animal could not manage. Each step seemed an effort, but the horse endured. Travelers passing by in wagons or cars cast puzzled looks, some even laughing outright at the sight of the worn rancher leading such a pitiful creature. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, offering no defense but his quiet determination. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had settled, painting the horizon in streaks of violet and gray. The land stretched wide, fenced pastures, a weathered barn, a farmhouse with its porch light glowing faintly. To Ethan it was home, though lately it had felt emptier than ever. He led the horse toward the barn, intending to settle him in a stall with fresh hay and water. But just as they reached the gate, the animal's legs buckled. With a heavy groan, he collapsed onto the wet earth, sides heaving, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him. For a moment, fear clawed at his chest, fear that the whispers at the auction had been right, that this horse was already too far gone. But as he placed a hand gently against the animal's neck, he felt the faint but steady beat of life. The horse lifted his head weakly, eyes catching Ethan's for the first time, not with emptiness, but with a question. Was this yet another place of pain or something different? Ethan spoke softly, his words carried more by intention than sound. Rest. You're safe now. He stayed there until the horse's breathing steadied, until the trembling eased, and the weight of the day settled over them both. The ranch was silent except for the distant rustle of wind in the trees. The night deepened, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the barn's lantern light flickered in the dark. Ethan stood at last, gathering his strength. Tomorrow would bring challenges he could not yet measure, feeding, healing, rebuilding trust where it had long been broken. But tonight, as he watched the fallen horse struggle to rise and finally manage to stand again, Ethan allowed a sliver of hope to surface. For the first time in months, he felt something shift inside him, subtle but undeniable. He had not just bought a horse for $1. He had taken responsibility for a soul on the edge of surrender. And whether anyone else believed in the choice or not, he was determined to see it through. The horse stood swaying in the lantern glow, scarred and broken, yet still standing. Ethan opened the barn doors wide, guiding him toward shelter. The storm outside was fading, but a different storm, the kind that tests patience, courage, and faith, was only just beginning. And though neither man nor beast knew what lay ahead, both had taken the first step into a story that would demand more from them than either imagined. The gavel's echo from the auction still seemed to hang in the air, but here, on this quiet ranch, it no longer sounded like an ending. It sounded like a beginning. ChatGPT said, "The morning after the auction broke with a thin veil of mist that clung to the pastures." Ethan stepped out onto the porch with a cup of black coffee in hand, his eyes drawn immediately to the barn. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind, the laughter of the crowd, the hollow crack of the gavel, the sight of the horse collapsing at his gate. For a moment, he wondered if he had been foolish to bring the animal home. Yet beneath that doubt lay something steadier, a conviction that would not release him. He set his cup aside and walked toward the barn, boots crunching against the damp earth. Inside, the horse stood in the corner of the stall, sides heaving faintly as though the night had been a trial of endurance. His coat was still matted with dried rain and dirt, but his eyes, dulled though they were, flickered with cautious awareness as Ethan entered. The rancher moved slowly, careful not to spook him, carrying a bucket of fresh water and a small ration of oats. Setting them down, he stepped back, giving space. The horse eyed the food warily, then looked at Ethan, as if uncertain whether the offering was a trick. Minutes passed before he finally lowered his head and ate. Ethan exhaled a quiet breath of relief. It was a beginning. As the days stretched on, the horse, whom Ethan named Ash, resisted every attempt at closeness. He flinched when Ethan lifted a hand, shied from the brush, and tensed at the sound of boots on wood. Patience became Ethan's only tool. He rose each morning before the sun, spending hours just sitting outside the stall, speaking softly about ordinary things, the work left on the ranch, the stubborn fence in need of repair, the way the wind changed with the seasons. His words were not for comprehension but for comfort, each syllable carrying a steadiness that Ash had long been denied. It was during one of those evenings, as lantern light warmed the barn, that Ethan noticed the scars more clearly. Thick welts lined Ash's back, cross-hatched as though from repeated lashes. His eyes darkened as he traced the cruel pattern, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Whoever had owned this horse before had not merely worked him, they had broken him with deliberate cruelty. Ethan's hand hovered just above the scarred skin, not daring to touch, but his voice dropped to a whisper. "They're gone now. You're here, and I'll never raise a hand against you." Progress came slowly, marked not by grand gestures, but by the smallest shifts. One morning Ash ate from Ethan's palm instead of the bucket. Another evening he allowed the brush to graze his mane, standing tense but still. The first time Ethan laid a hand upon his neck, Ash flinched sharply, then stilled, breathing fast as if bracing for a blow that never came. Ethan did not move, letting the silence speak for him until at last the horse lowered his head, a quiet surrender, not of defeat, but fragile trust. The neighbors, however, were less patient. One afternoon, a man named Harris leaned over the fence, arms crossed, his expression skeptical. "You really think that horse is worth the trouble? Some animals just don't come back from what they've seen. You'd be better off putting him down." Ethan looked at him steadily, not with anger, but with quiet certainty. "He's not finished yet," he replied. "Neither am I." Harris shook his head, muttering about wasted effort, and walked away. But Ethan's resolve only hardened. Still, doubt lingered in quiet moments. At night, when the ranch lay silent, he wondered if Harris was right. The ranch itself was struggling. Bills piled on the kitchen table, fences sagged, pastures needed tending. Time spent with Ash was time stolen from work that desperately needed doing. Yet each time he considered giving up, he remembered the way Ash's eyes had met his at the gate, the faint, questioning light buried beneath despair. He could not walk away from that. Weeks passed. Ash's coat began to regain a sheen, his ribs less prominent beneath layers of fresh feed. Strength returned to his limbs, though the limp in his hind leg remained. One crisp evening, Ethan led him outside the barn for the first time, the rope loose in his hand. The open pasture stretched before them, golden in the fading light. Ash hesitated, hooves sinking into the grass, ears flicking nervously. Ethan did not push. Instead, he walked ahead a few steps, letting the rope slacken, offering freedom rather than command. After a long pause, Ash followed. His steps were slow, but with each one his head lifted higher, ears pricking at the distant sounds of the ranch, the creak of the windmill, the rush of the stream beyond the hill. That night, Ethan lingered on the porch long after Ash had been settled. The stars glimmered faintly, and the air held the bite of autumn. He thought of his wife, of the way she once dreamed of filling the ranch with life, horses, dogs, even children they never had. She had spoken of competing at the county fair, not for glory but for the joy of it, the thrill of seeing her horse run beneath the wide sky with the world watching. The memory ached, but it also stirred something new. As he glanced toward the barn, he wondered, could Ash one day carry that dream, not as hers alone, but as theirs together? The thought unsettled him. It was one thing to heal a broken creature, another entirely to ask him to rise again in front of a world that had already dismissed him as worthless. Ethan shook his head, telling himself it was foolishness. Ash was not ready, and perhaps never would be. Still, the idea lingered, like an ember refusing to die out. One morning, as Ethan mucked out the stalls, he noticed Ash standing at the gate, watching him intently. There was a sharpness in his gaze that had not been there before, a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps recognition. When Ethan opened the stall, Ash stepped forward without hesitation, brushing his muzzle lightly against Ethan's arm. It was the first gesture of trust freely given, uncoaxed. Ethan's chest tightened, and he found himself smiling in a way he had not for years. "We're getting somewhere, aren't we?" he murmured. That evening, a letter arrived in the post. It was a notice for the upcoming county fair, printed in bold ink, listing competitions and prizes. Ethan held it in his hands, the paper trembling slightly. He remembered his wife's words, her laughter as she spoke of ribbons and cheering crowds. Ash's scars, his limp, his broken past, all of it stood against the possibility. And yet, Ethan could not shake the image of a horse standing proud in the arena, proving every whisper wrong. He folded the letter carefully and set it aside, but the seed had been planted. Later that night, as the barn settled into silence, Ethan noticed Ash staring out through the open door into the distance, ears tilted toward some memory only he could hear. There was something haunted in his posture, but also a strength that was quietly returning. Ethan leaned against the stall door, speaking more to himself than the horse. "Maybe we both need a reason to keep going." The lantern light flickered, shadows playing across the walls. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying the promise of change. Ethan knew the path ahead would not be simple. Trust was fragile, healing was slow, and the fair, if it ever came to that, would test them both in ways they could scarcely imagine. Yet, as Ash lowered his head and exhaled a long, steady breath, Ethan felt the weight of doubt lift, if only slightly. The ranch was still quiet, the night still long, but something had shifted. The bond between man and horse was no longer just survival. It was the beginning of a shared journey, one that neither had chosen but both were learning to accept. And as the stars wheeled overhead, the story pressed forward, its next chapter waiting just beyond the horizon. The first signs of winter crept into the valley as frost clung to the edges of the fields, and the mornings carried a sharp bite that made breath plume in the air. Ethan rose earlier now, lighting the lantern before dawn to begin the routine of caring for Ash. The horse had grown stronger. The sharp outlines of his ribs had softened beneath new weight, and his coat carried a faint gleam where before it had been dull. Yet the limp in his hind leg remained, a constant reminder of the trials that had nearly broken him. Ethan knew it would never vanish entirely, but each day he hoped Ash might learn to move with it, not against it. Training began not with force, but with rhythm. Ethan walked the pasture alongside Ash, guiding him in slow circles, coaxing him into steady strides. The horse resisted at first, muscles tightening, eyes flashing with old fear. He pulled at the rope, reared slightly, snorting with wild defiance. Ethan held firm, not with the harsh yank of a hand accustomed to dominance, but with patience, his voice low, a steady murmur that carried calm through the chill air. "Easy now. I'm not here to break you. We do this together." Progress came in uneven steps. One morning, Ash followed the lead with surprising grace, head lifted, movement smooth. By the next, he balked at even leaving the stall, eyes clouded again by doubt. Ethan swallowed his frustration, reminding himself that healing never moved in straight lines. He remembered his own nights of grief after losing his wife, days when he thought he could go on, and others when the weight crushed him flat. Ash, in his own way, was wrestling with the same battle. One afternoon, as Ethan tightened the cinch of an old saddle he had not used in years, Ash froze, muscles quivering beneath the worn leather. His ears pinned flat, his body surged sideways in panic. The rope burned Ethan's palms as he tried to steady him. For a moment it seemed Ash would tear loose completely, eyes rolling with terror of some memory too raw to forget. Ethan let the rope slacken, stepping close but lowering his hands, his voice a quiet tether. "No one's going to hurt you again. Not ever." Slowly, the panic ebbed. Ash stood trembling, foam dampening his coat, but he did not bolt. Ethan knew then that whatever had been done to him in the past had been cruel, tied to the weight of a saddle, and the whip of commands shouted too harshly. If they were to move forward, trust would have to be stronger than fear. The days shortened, the light fading faster each evening. Ethan began working Ash in the round pen, a wide circle of packed dirt bordered by wooden rails. At first the horse resisted, ears back, movement stiff. But gradually, under Ethan's steady guidance, he began to find rhythm. Hooves struck the ground with a cadence that echoed through the valley, breath puffing in clouds that caught the lantern light. Ethan watched with a cautious pride, seeing not perfection but progress, an animal once discarded now reclaiming fragments of strength. But just as hope rose, so too did setbacks. One frigid morning, Ash stumbled mid-stride, collapsing onto his knees with a sharp grunt. Ethan rushed to his side, fear clawing at his chest. For a heartbeat, the old whispers from the auction returned, worthless, broken, doomed. Ash lay still, sides heaving, eyes glazed as though surrender lingered close. Ethan knelt beside him, hands pressed to his neck, whispering words he barely understood himself. "Not yet, boy. Not like this. We've come too far." When the vet arrived, his face was grave. He ran practiced hands along Ash's leg, frowning at the deep-set damage. "He'll never be what he once was," the vet admitted. "The injury's too old. You can keep him comfortable, maybe give him light work, but expecting more, well, that might be too much." Ethan nodded silently, but inside, conflict churned. Was he pushing Ash too far, asking him to rise when his body begged for rest? Or was he giving him the chance to reclaim the dignity stripped away by others? That night a storm rolled in, lashing rain against the windows, wind rattling the barn doors. The world outside roared, but it was the noise inside the pen that drew Ethan from his bed. Ash, wild-eyed, thrashed against the stall, fear ignited by the thunder's relentless crash. Ethan wrenched open the door, stumbling into the chaos. The horse reared, striking the air, nostrils flared with panic. Ethan did not grab the rope or force him still. Instead, he sank to the ground, rain soaking through his shirt, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "I'm here. I'm not leaving. You don't have to fight this alone." For long moments, Ash circled, hoofs striking mud, tail whipping. Then, slowly, his frenzy ebbed. He stopped, sides heaving, eyes fixed on Ethan sitting calmly in the storm. The rancher remained unmoving, a quiet anchor in the tempest. Step by step, Ash approached, lowering his head until his breath warmed Ethan's shoulder. In that fragile moment, something shifted irreversibly. The bond no longer rested on food, patience, or careful training. It was trust, raw and unbreakable, forged in fear but sealed in choice. From that night onward, Ash began to move differently. He followed Ethan's lead not with hesitation, but with a quiet confidence. His limp remained, his scars did not fade, but there was a new steadiness in the way he carried himself. Ethan noticed it first in the way Ash lifted his head when strangers passed, no longer shrinking, but watching. Then, in the round pen, where his strides lengthened, uneven but strong, Ethan found himself thinking again of the county fair. The folded notice still sat on the kitchen table, edges worn from being read too many times. At first the thought had felt like a distant dream, almost cruel in its ambition. But now, watching Ash circle the pen with fire flickering again in his eyes, Ethan wondered if perhaps it was not about ribbons or prizes at all. Perhaps it was about standing before the world that had called him worthless and showing that brokenness was not the end. He did not make the decision aloud, not yet. Instead, he simply worked alongside Ash each day, guiding him through exercises, rewarding the smallest victories. Neighbors still shook their heads, muttering that he was wasting effort on a lost cause. But Ethan no longer heard them. What mattered was the horse who, against all odds, was learning to trust again, and the man who found healing mirrored in that fragile trust. One crisp morning, as the first snow dusted the fence lines, Ethan led Ash into the pasture. The horse's breath rose in clouds, mane catching the pale sunlight. Without command, he broke into a trot, uneven yet determined, circling wide before galloping with a power that startled Ethan. He was not fast, not flawless, but he was alive in a way that had been absent before. Ethan felt a rush of pride swell in his chest, so fierce it nearly brought tears. As Ash slowed, returning to stand beside him, Ethan placed a hand on his scarred neck. The decision formed quietly, solid as the ground beneath his boots. They would go to the fair. Not to win, not to prove anything to the world, but to stand tall together, a man and a horse who had been broken and had chosen not to remain so. The wind carried the distant sound of church bells, faint against the mountains. Ethan turned toward the barn, Ash following close at his side. The journey ahead would be hard, the challenge is certain, but the bond between them had been tested in storm and silence, and it had held. That was enough. The county fair was weeks away, yet the first step toward it had already been taken. The morning of the county fair arrived with a brittle chill, the kind that sharpened the air and set every sound echoing just a little longer. Ethan stood in the barn before dawn, hands working slowly over Ash's coat with a brush. The horse's body bore every mark of his past, the scars across his back and the faint hitch in his stride that would never fully leave him, yet his eyes had changed. Where once there had been only emptiness, now there burned a quiet flame, steady and watchful. Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing in. He knew they weren't going there to win. They were going to stand, to show that brokenness did not mean defeat. The truck rattled down the winding roads, the trailer bumping gently with each turn. Ethan glanced back through the side mirror, catching sight of Ash shifting inside, ears flicking as though listening to a world he hadn't faced in years. The fairgrounds loomed on the horizon, banners snapping in the wind, voices already rising in excited chatter. Crowds gathered in clusters, children pointing at polished horses with braided manes and proud, arching necks. Against their gleaming coats, Ash seemed even more ordinary, his scars stark reminders of where he had come from. Ethan felt the glances, the whispers, just as he had at the auction. That's him, the $1 horse. Some laughed softly, others shook their heads. He led Ash slowly toward the warm-up ring, ignoring the sideways looks. The horse's steps were cautious at first, uneven on the packed dirt, but Ethan's voice steadied him. Easy, boy. Just you and me. He mounted carefully, his weight balanced, giving Ash time to adjust. For a breathless moment, the horse stiffened, ears pinned, haunted memory flickering through him. Ethan leaned forward, whispering near his ear, "No one's hurting you now. Trust me." Ash exhaled a long, steadying breath and began to move. Their turn in the arena came sooner than Ethan expected. The announcer's voice boomed across the fairgrounds, calling their names. The crowd shifted with curiosity as the scarred horse entered, led by the quiet rancher who had paid less than the price of a cup of coffee to bring him home. The noise dulled to murmurs, a tide of skepticism that pressed against them like a wall. Ethan felt Ash falter under its weight, but he tightened his hold on the reins just enough to guide, not to command. It's all right. They don't matter. Just us. The first strides were shaky. Ash's limp showed clearly, his head bobbing slightly with each uneven step. A ripple of laughter rose from one side of the stands. Ethan's chest tightened, but he pressed his heels lightly, urging Ash onward. They circled the arena, pace slow but deliberate. Something in the horse's posture began to change. His ears flicked forward, his neck arched, and though each step carried the memory of pain, there was a strength in it, raw and undeniable. The murmurs in the crowd softened, replaced by a strange hush as people leaned forward to watch. Ethan guided Ash through simple movements, circles, halts, turns, not dazzling displays of speed or agility, but quiet demonstrations of trust. Every time Ash obeyed, it was not out of fear but out of choice. When they halted in the center of the arena, Ethan dismounted and stood beside him, resting a hand on his scarred neck. The silence that followed stretched long, heavy with unspoken recognition. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with a few scattered claps, hesitant and uncertain, but it grew, swelling until the arena rang with it. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes, though he kept his expression steady. He looked at Ash, whose ears flicked at the sound, but whose eyes no longer held fear. Instead, they carried a spark that had once seemed gone forever. For Ethan, that was victory enough. When the judging was announced, Ash did not place first, nor second, nor even third. But the announcer paused before setting down the list, his voice carrying a different weight. Today we recognize a competitor who showed not perfection but perseverance. A horse once left behind, now standing tall through patience and trust. For resilience in the face of hardship, we award this special ribbon. He lifted a ribbon of deep blue, pinning it to Ash's bridle. The crowd rose to their feet, applause rolling like thunder. Children rushed forward afterward, their small hands reaching to stroke Ash's muzzle. He stood calm among them, no longer shrinking, as though he understood this moment belonged to him. Ethan stood a step back, letting the horse receive the attention. Pride swelled inside him, not the pride of accomplishment, but of witnessing transformation. This animal, once dismissed as worthless, had claimed back his dignity. And in some quiet way, Ethan felt he had reclaimed his own. That evening, as the fairgrounds emptied and the sun dipped low, Ethan led Ash back into the trailer. The ribbon hung loosely from the bridle, swaying with each step. Neighbors who had once mocked him stopped and awed in respect, their eyes softer now. Harris, the man who had told him to put Ash down, approached with a sheepish expression. Didn't think he had it in him, he admitted. Ethan only smiled faintly, replying, neither did anyone else. That's what makes it worth it. The drive home was long, the road winding through fields bathed in twilight. Ethan glanced into the mirror, watching Ash stand steady, no longer the trembling creature he had once been. Instead of emptiness, there was presence, an animal who had chosen to rise again. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, feeling an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. Back at the ranch, the air was cool and still. Ethan opened the trailer door, leading Ash out into the pasture. The horse paused, ears flicking, before trotting forward with uneven but powerful strides. He broke into a gallop, mane streaming in the moonlight, moving not with grace, but with unrestrained freedom. Ethan stood at the fence, watching, the ribbon still clutched in his hand. He thought of his wife, of her laughter and her dreams for this ranch. He raised his eyes to the sky and whispered, "We did it." Ash circled back, slowing as he neared, and came to stand beside him. Ethan reached up, resting his hand gently on the horse's scarred face. The silence of the night stretched around them, but it was not empty. It was full of trust, of resilience, of second chances. Ethan understood then that this was more than the story of a broken horse. It was the story of how healing could find its way into the most wounded hearts, if only given time, patience, and belief. The ranch felt alive again, no longer burdened only by memory, but carrying the weight of hope. Ethan led Ash into the barn, settling him for the night. As he closed the stall door, the horse turned his head, eyes following him with quiet recognition. For the first time, Ethan felt he was no longer walking through grief alone. The lantern light flickered as he stepped out, casting long shadows across the ground. Above, the stars burned bright, distant yet steadfast. Ethan lifted the ribbon in his hand, its fabric catching the glow. It was not the symbol of victory in competition, but of something greater, the triumph of trust, the proof that even the most broken can rise when someone believes. And as the night deepened, Ethan felt the story they had begun together was far from over. It had only just found its stride.